we live in the data-driven world, and data has impact in our everyday life. In today's competitive world, right, the companies who are able to get a great insight from their data potential in the shorter period of time, they will be in the market game. It is that simple.
This is Chair, place where we discuss innovations. You know that awful feeling when you running out of storage in your cell phone? Well, in the last 2 decades alone, we amassed more than 59 zettabytes of data. That's, let me see this correctly, that's 125 million years of Friends, which is also my favorite TV show. The problem at hand is how to properly and ethically use this data in order to stay ahead of the competition. So we will try to answer this question today with help of our guest, Bojan Ćirić. Bojan is a senior leader in Deloitte, New York, and he's a part of analytics and cognitive team. In his spare time, he's a passionate cook who dreams of becoming a chef. So, Bojan, welcome, pleasure to have you here today.
Thank you for having me.
So we are going to talk about data today, and obviously humans are gathering data for a long time now, since humanity started. But how this has changed in this digital era that we're living right now?
Thank you, Nemanja. I think this is a great question, and it's very interesting subject. We live in the data-driven world, and data has impact in our everyday life. But what does that mean, right? So let's look at a few examples. So if you look at Facebook is most popular media company, but owns no content. If you look at another big company like Uber, it's world's largest taxi provider, but they owns no vehicle, right? If you look at Airbnb, which is the world's largest accommodation provider, owns no real estate. And finally, we look at Alibaba, which is one of the most valuable retailer, owns no inventory. So if you look at this, all these companies are technology and data companies. At the other side, the data is rapidly changing. So you just mentioned one great example about the volume of data, that every few years we have the double of capacity of data that we are creating, processing, using, and so on. But there are other aspects of data. Let's say the variety, right? At the beginning of the data journey, we were able to process, manage, and use only structured data. But now we have semi-structured, we have unstructured data. We are processing images, we are processing videos, we are processing voice. You have the situation that when you're talking with a customer representative of some company complaining about their products or something, we have the analysis on the real time of this information, and the customer representative gets the valuable insight how to manage and drive that conversation. That gives another aspect of data when we talk about the velocity, right? That in the real time we process, we manage data, and we provide a valuable insight. So in general, this is we making decisions every day. We're making personal decisions, we make business decisions, and the instrumental for these decisions is the data, or actually the insights that we can get from this data. The better insight, the better decision will be. And in today's competitive world, right, the companies who are able to get a great insight from their data potential in the shorter period of time, they will be in the market game. It is that simple.
So you mentioned some of the companies there, and obviously, if company is not leveraging the data, it's going to be destroyed by the market, right? It's not going to succeed. Can you share with me? I'm sure that based on your experience, you have great stories of data usage. And can you share with me some good examples of how some companies use data to improve business, and after that basically kill all the competition with it?
Yeah, for instance, I mentioned these companies, right? Obviously, everybody knows them, but there are some other areas, right? So, for instance, one good example is John Deere company. John Deere is one of the world's largest provider of the farm equipment, right? And they are well known for the decades for doing this, but now basically they also become the data company, right? So because with the development of the Internet of Things, the devices that can basically take and the sensors that can take and transmit the data over the internet, they tremendously improve the agricultural business, because now you can put a lot of Internet of Things, the different kind of sensors in the fields. You can get the real-time information about the weather. You can get imaging of the field, and based on that you can make the optimal decisions how actually you will manage that field. But also you can do the setup of the equipment, let's say to do the spraying or something like this. So this is something that tremendously improve the outcomes and the value of the of that specific business.
Yeah, you gave me the great example, which is a bit counterintuitive, because we are talking about agriculture, and whenever somebody is talking about data, it's usually technological companies. And I remember, I think 10 or 15 episodes before, I had one guy here from one huge company here in Serbia, and they talked about they're doing lots of agriculture and everything, sugar beet. That's something that they do, and they talked about Uberizing their fleet, and it was very interesting to me then how companies that are like traditional, that don't have any obvious connections with data, they're becoming data companies. And I will leave that on the side now, and I want to ask you about the technological companies. Let's maybe from your perspective, from your experience, can you share with me how you see, for example, how Netflix are using the data, and how is Netflix leveraging the data that they have?
Yeah, basically, I think most of us actually heard about the TV show, the House of Cards, very popular show. And there is an interesting story, basically how Netflix actually committed to do the 2 seasons, even without knowing that the first season will be success. So basically, they based on their large data potential, taking the different informations about, let's say we're watching the movie, right? We're doing some ratings, we picking some movies or shows we want to watch, and based on that they create a segmentation of their customers. They literally create our profile, what are our preferences, what we want to watch, and so on, right? And based on that, basically they were able to cross that with some additional information about that specific show, let's say the House of Cards, meaning who will be director, who will be cast, right, and what will be the topic of the specific show. And then crossing this large information about the Netflix users with some characteristics of the specific show, they really, with a big certainty, they know that will be success. Right.
And they nail it, actually.
Yeah,
right?
And they nail it, right? So that's...
Yeah, interesting story with this is usually how it goes. You have a pilot, you test the market, you have a focus group, but they did it without it, right?
Yeah, and even they go further, right? They created the specific profiles of users, and they created different trailers for that show, which will actually target the specific users group. So that was done one additional thing, right? That they secured the success of that show.
Okay, so Netflix, that's a great example, but let's use another one. Maybe, I know there is lots of talk about Elon Musk and what he's doing with SpaceX and Starlink, but Tesla is something that the company that is almost basically financing a lot of his endeavors. So let's talk about Tesla, how they are leveraging data and big data and analytics and everything.
Yeah, Tesla is great company, great example, and one of the most innovative companies right in the world. And what is interesting and hot topic now is for instance, self-driving technology, right? So, and the self-driving technology is completely based on the data and advanced analytics on top of the data. So I will give you example. So self-driving technology, basically, if you want to break down that specific term, that goes into 4 different areas. So one is the perception, right? So you need to know what objects is around you, the other vehicles and everything, right? The second is localization. You need to know where you are at this specific point of time. The third part is planning, right? So you need to find the optimal route to go from the point A to the point B, right? And finally, the fourth aspect is control, that you basically need to steer now between point A and point B, different angles of steering and everything, right? So these are the segments of self-driving, and every of these segments actually requires a huge amount of
Enormous
data,
amount of data.
and also the different kind of analytics algorithms who will analyze this data and make decisions during that self-driving process, so that you don't do any crash or something like that, right? So this is the typical example where basically data is really instrumental. Data and different analytic techniques on top of that is really instrumental to make some features, some advanced features possible, and to make this innovative. Yeah.
Good thing that you mentioned self-driving. I saw, like, I think a couple of weeks ago, there's a guy who was arrested in the States, who was driving, who was sleeping actually in the back while Tesla was self-driving. So this is example how how ethics and everything crashes with the data, right? One of the lower examples that we
Yeah,
can
it's a great example, but also gives some another aspect that we need to talk about, and basically this is about the data management, how to make sure that, let's say, if you have huge amount of data, if we make the decisions based on this data, how to make sure that this data is actually accurate and that we can trust to this data,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
So we mentioned this couple of examples of good examples, how companies are leveraging data and they're getting better and getting more profitable. But can you share with me some examples of the companies that haven't leveraged data and maybe die in the process?
Yeah, I will give you a few examples of different companies. So most recent example is, for instance, for financial services industry, right? Where this is my core industry. So we have one global bank which actually got a fine of $400 million, right, in the US. And the only reason, because their fine is basically that they do the poor management of their data, right? So that's the bank now working to fix their data, but that's a huge liability, right? Another aspect is, if you look at let's say, we all know about the financial crisis 2008. Right, when we have the double failure of data, first the bank did the poor management of data. They did a lot of house loans to the customers who were basically insolvent, right? So they did a poor analysis about to whom they need to give the loan, right? So that's one thing. The second failure is that regulators actually fail to control the banks, right? To control the data and how banks are operating. And then we came to the situation that the whole system was close to crash. So basically, as a result of this, there are a set of regulations and the scrutiny. So now basically the banks are forced to manage their data on the proper way. And that's the only way that you can make the financial system stable. So the data management and the data comes into the very core focus on the entire business. A few other examples is, for instance, Yahoo or Nokia. So Yahoo basically was dominant search provider, but again, based on the market research and the poor analytics, right, they decided more to focus on the media content rather than search, and then we get a Google actually who come and overpass them, right? And even there was in situation to make the acquisition of Google. They decided not to go. So this is another example where you making the poor decision because you
even though you
don't
have a lot of data to make that decision.
Yes, so that's another example is Nokia, who was dominant mobile service provider, mobile device provider. They even make a good strategy. They created their operating system, Symbian, but they failed to recognize that actually the future is in the smartphones and the applications. And then we have the Apple, who came with a very innovative approach, and then Nokia actually failed, and now basically does not get out from that.
Yeah. And they had a dominant position on the market.
Yes, and now is out from this. So that's all about the data, and because all decisions that you make on top of the data.
There is a addition to the data story, and it's buzzword of the day. When somebody's talking about data and big data, there is always AI connected to this. My question is a bit, I won't say tricky, but I want to hear your opinion on this. How you see AI in terms of stealing people's job in the future? What do you think about this?
That's very interesting question, right? So definitely the artificial intelligence, the algorithms, methods taking a lot in terms of managing the data in the future, about extracting that insight from data in order to make the good decisions, right? On the other hand, yes, there is concern, right, that with the process automation, with data automation and everything, a lot of jobs will be lost in the...
And that your company won't be here in the future, right?
But on the other hand, I really think that that human presence in some aspect will be still required, right, in that process. On the other side, I think the future will create a new type of jobs where basically human can work collaboratively with artificial intelligence, and again make that insight that will win the game in the competitive.
Yeah, I saw one research recently that said that in 2035, 85% of the jobs that are going to be at that point doesn't exist at this point.
Yeah.
So I'm sure that AI can influence that very hard.
Absolutely, but that happened even if we go back in the history, right? A lot of jobs that were actual 50 years ago now does not exist, right? So
yeah,
I think that is naturally, right? So.
Yeah. Just speeding up with all the data.
At this point, we can just try to predict what will going in the, let's say, near future, but we'll see what time will bring it to us. Yeah.
So let's stay a bit more on AI subject, and we are talking about how AI can or should or would take people's job. But can AI mess up big time, since we are moving at a record speed now with all the data and leveraging that data and using AI for the data? Can AI mess up?
Yes, absolutely, right. So basically, when we talk about the AI, even if you go more specifically, good example is machine learning, right? Where you create some algorithms which we are able actually to learn from the previous experience and the data, and then to provide some predictions what will going on in the future, what will happen in the future. So when you get outcomes from this data processing and analytics from machine learning, this is something that They say, okay, this is the best I can do, the best prediction I can do based on the previous experience and the quality of the algorithms that I use. But then at the end, right, maybe we can connect to the previous question, right, where is the place of the human here, right? At the end, the human is making decision, right? So based on this data, now the human need to process that and to decide, whether I will go with that decision or I will make the opposite decision. So that's basically definitely something where the humans still have very important place in that decision process, especially for the big decisions.
And we are moving whenever it's human decision, it's in the question. We need to ask question of ethics. How we can look at the data and leveraging data from the perspectives of ethics.
Yeah, that's great question. So we talk about machine learning algorithms and everything, but now there is a question whether I make some business decision based on the outcomes of the machine learning algorithms, even if that decision is unethical, right? So that's the dilemma, right? That many business executives have, right? And then there is something that we call for instance, algorithmic biasing, right? So, and there is the companies, the big companies, they have the data policies, and one of the statements in their data policy is that they treat that ethics questions with preventing the algorithm biasing. And what does that mean in the practice, right? So, let's say if you send application for job, right? So you have the machines, you use the machine learning to process the resumes of the candidates, right? And then you make that first selection is typically made by machine, right? Not by human. But you need to make sure that algorithm that is used to make the selection of the candidates, right, does not take in consideration, let's say, the age or the gender of the candidate or the nationality, right? So you are committing actually that you will not put that things will be decision-making factor in the algorithms for that. So that's another question. Another important question is also privacy, right? So with all this volume of data that you mentioned at the beginning, we providing a lot of private information to the different kind of platforms like social networks, application for different products, loans and everything. So that data privacy question is also important because you never know how somebody will use this data, right, for not just good reasons, right? And that is another aspect which is now heavily regulated. We have the GDPR in the Europe. We have the California Consumer Protection Act in the US, where you actually now the companies, if you want to use your privacy data, they must get a consent from you for that, right? So that's another aspect where basically society try to regulate and to control that data craziness. Yeah.
So I always like to finish with the future and what is future bringing to us. So most of our talk today is about data and how we are leveraging data, how we are manipulating data, right? How this is going to look like in the future?
So in the future, the human brain is still perfection, right? And we are not yet there. When we talk about artificial intelligence, this is still artificial, right? This is good enough maybe for the time we live and do the business, but for the future that will not be sufficient. So, and as I mentioned at the beginning, that data is rapidly changing. So at the beginning, specifically, at the beginning of the data journey, we just have the structural data, then we have the data warehouses, then we have the big data, right? A few years ago, that was big boom around the big data, but now when we talk today, we also know that big data is not solution for all the problems that we have. At this point, one of the hot topics is knowledge graphs, right? And this is specifically what I'm working at Deloitte now. I'm co-lead of the initiative, where you're trying to manage, organize, process, and use the data similar way like we do that in the human brain, right? So that will open another endless possibilities to not just the manage data, but to use them on the effective way to get this data insight and to try to simulate how we doing and process the information in our brain.
Bon, thank you so much for this conversation. I enjoyed today. And for you out there, next Thursday, next Innovation Talk, and see you then. Subscribe in the meantime.
Thank you. It was great pleasure.